Imagine this. Your home is burning before your very eyes. Trapped inside those roaring flames are 5 children you love more than life itself. But something is wrong. You hear no screams for help. No crying, no scratching at the windows. There is only the deafening roar of the massive fire devouring the house and the eerie, skeletal cracking of wooden beams splintering in the heat. Did the children die instantly without pain, or were they already gone from that room before the first flame even flickered? This is no ordinary house fire. This is a chronicle of the most bizarre and cruel vanishing in history, where the blessing of Christmas Eve curdled into a curse from hell. Let us go back in time. December 24th, 1945, in the deep woods of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The 2-story wooden house where George Sauter, an Italian immigrant, lived with his wife Jenny and their 10 children, was buzzing with the excitement of Christmas Eve. In the center of the living room, a brilliantly decorated tree sparkled, and beneath it sat a mountain of gift boxes for the children. Outside, white snow fell softly, muffling every sound of the world, creating a night that should have been nothing but peaceful and still. 4 of the children, including the youngest, Sylvia, had gone to bed early. But Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, these 5 children wanted to stay up late, listening to the radio and soaking in the holiday cheer. Their parents gave their permission with a generous heart. Go to sleep before it gets too late, they said. It was a simple parting word, with no inkling that it would be the final time they would ever speak to their children. But this peace was merely the silence before the storm. In truth, this tragedy had been prophesied days earlier. Here is where the first chilling omen appears. A few days before the fire, a strange man was seen lurking in the backyard of the Sauter home. He was staring intently at the electric fuse box leading into the house. When George asked who he was, the man wore a peculiar smile and spoke words of ice. This fuse box is going to cause a fire one day. Your house will burn down, and your children will vanish like smoke. George dismissed him as a madman and chased him away, but the look in that man's eyes held a murderous intent that went far beyond a simple grudge. Another strange omen occurred that very morning. As the children were returning home from school, a mysterious black sedan followed them, watching their every move. The men inside rolled down the windows and stared at each child's face one by one, as if they were selecting young lambs to be taken to a slaughterhouse. Then came the hour of fate, shortly after midnight. The telephone rang inside the house. In the dead silence of the early morning, that sharp, piercing ring felt ominous. Jenny rubbed the sleep from her eyes and went down to the first floor to answer. Hello? But the voice on the other end was a woman she did not recognize. The stranger asked for a name Jenny did not know. Just as Jenny was about to say she had the wrong number, a bone-chilling sound came through the receiver. It was the clinking of glass and the boisterous, chaotic laughter of many people. And when the woman heard Jenny's voice, she let out a bizarre, high-pitched cackle. He, I must have the wrong number, she said. That laughter lingered in Jenny's ears like a witch's curse. She hurriedly hung up and returned to bed. But the real terror was only beginning. Just as she tried to drift back to sleep, a heavy thud echoed from the roof. It sounded as if someone had hurled a heavy stone onto the top of the house. Then came the sound of something rolling down the shingles. Jenny heard it, but she forced herself to ignore it, thinking it was just a branch falling from the forest. If she had known that was the sound of an incendiary device landing right above her children's bedroom, she would have run out barefoot into the snow. 30 minutes later, the acrid smell of smoke stung their nostrils. When George and Jenny opened their eyes, the first-floor living room was already engulfed in a sea of fire. The flames were like a living organism, clawing their way up the walls. George screamed frantically, waking the children on the first floor and ushering them outside. But the stairs leading to the second floor, where 5 children were sleeping, had already become a massive pillar of fire. Maurice, Louis, children, George screamed their names until his throat was raw. But from above the burning stairs, there was no answer, not even a single whimper. George ran outside. He had to save the children through the second-floor windows. He looked for the sturdy ladder that always leaned against the exterior wall. But the heavy ladder, which was always in its place, had vanished without a trace. It was as if a ghost had taken it. In a desperate panic, he decided to use his truck parked next to the house. He wanted to drive it under the window and climb onto the roof. The Christmas morning sun rose with a cruel brightness, but only a heavy, ashen despair hung over the site of the Soder home. The fire had died out in just 45 minutes. In that short window of time, the grand two-story wooden house had been reduced to a heap of black charcoal. Firefighters, police, and even the townspeople joined in, sifting through the debris with their bare hands, while acrid smoke still stung the air. The parents' hope had already been buried with the ashes. They simply wanted to recover even a small bone fragment of their children, to lay them to rest in a warm, hallowed place rather than leaving them under the cold, indifferent snow. But as they cleared the wreckage, the faces of those searching turned from grief to sheer bewilderment. In the ashes, they found the springs of burned furniture, fragments of broken dishes, and even glass bottles melted by the intense heat. But the most vital evidence was missing. Not a single piece of human bone emerged from the ruins. 5 children had been trapped in that small room, yet not a single skull, not a finger bone, not even a heat-resistant tooth fragment was discovered. They had truly vanished into the air like smoke. The fire department offered a nonsensical explanation to the distraught parents. They claimed the heat of the fire was like a furnace, so intense that even the children's bones had completely cremated into a handful of dust. George Soder, ignorant of such things and in the depths of shock, had no choice but to believe them. Without a proper funeral, the priest offered prayers for the children to the empty air. The case seemed destined to close as a tragic accident caused by a faulty electric wire. Here is where the first shocking chapter of the investigation begins. Jenny Soder, the mother, could not bring herself to believe the fire department's words. Every night she woke up screaming from dreams of her children burning. Her maternal instinct demanded the truth. Jenny began a grisly and mournful experiment of her own in their backyard. She bought chicken bones, pork bones, and beef bones from the market and hurled them into a roaring fire. For 2-3 hours, she stoked the flames with a fierce intensity. Even when she poured oil and pushed the fire to its maximum temperature, the result was always the same. The bones would blacken and turn to charcoal, but their shape remained perfectly intact. Unless smashed with a hammer, bone does not simply disappear. And in a wooden house fire that lasted only 45 minutes, the total vanishing of 5 sturdy human skulls and spinal columns without leaving a trace was scientifically impossible. Jenny clutched those charred animal bones and wailed. "It is a lie. They are lying to us. My children did not burn." It was a flicker of hope that the children were alive, but simultaneously, the start of an even greater terror, the realization that someone had taken them. The flames of suspicion spread uncontrollably. Think back to that night, that bizarre phone call and the woman's chilling laughter. The investigation claimed the caller was a local woman who simply dialed the wrong number. The police believed her and let her go without a second thought. But at the scene, a second piece of evidence was found that mocked the incompetence of the authorities. It was the telephone line. Contrary to the police report that a faulty wire started the fire, the phone line inspected later had not been burned through. It had been cleanly severed by a sharp cutting tool. Even more chilling was the calculated nature of the act. A common thief would have cut the main line at the top of the pole. But the perpetrator had found the exact line near the fuse box leading into the house and snipped it. This was the work of someone who knew the anatomy of this house perfectly. The killer had silenced the family's voice before even lighting the match. The fate of the missing ladder was equally maddening. The heavy ladder George had searched for to save his children was found days later in a forest embankment 75 feet away. Someone had moved the ladder just before the fire and hidden it under a shroud of dead leaves so that George could not reach the second floor. The 2 trucks that failed to start were not simply broken either. A mechanic later discovered there was nothing wrong with the engines. Someone had tampered with the spark plugs to ensure they stayed silent. The severed phone line, the hidden ladder, the tampered trucks. All this evidence pointed to a single conclusion. This was no accident. This was a calculated manhunt where the house was torched and every path of escape or rescue was perfectly blocked. The killer did not want the children to die in the fire. While they used the chaos to slip the children away, they had tied the parents' feet so they could not give chase. It was then that George remembered a man's face from his past and felt a jolt of terror. A few months before the fire, an insurance agent had visited their home. He had been aggressive, trying to pressure George into a policy, and when George refused, the man's face twisted into a demonic mask. "Your house will vanish like smoke one day," he cursed. "And your children will be destroyed. All because of your filthy mouth speaking against Mussolini." George Sodder, an Italian immigrant, often spoke out against the dictator Mussolini. At that time, the Italian immigrant community was split between those who worshipped Mussolini and those who opposed him. That agent's words were not a simple threat. They were a declaration of war. George was certain. That night, followers of the fascist regime had torched his home and kidnapped his 5 children to inflict the ultimate agony. In the ruins of the basement, the couple dug frantically once more. And there, they found a critical object. It was a piece of hard, charred rubber, which military experts later identified as a fragment of a napalm bomb, a pineapple bomb. That thud heard on the roof the night of the fire? That was the sound of this very device being hurled onto the children's bedroom. It was clear this was not just a fire, but a terrorist attack carried out with military weaponry. Yet, even with this blatant evidence, the police and fire department remained silent. Why were they in such a hurry to bury this case? Perhaps even they feared the massive mafia syndicate lurking behind the crime. No bones were found in the ashes, but instead, fragments of a far more horrifying truth were beginning to emerge. The children did not burn. They were taken into the darkness in the heart of the fire. And now, perhaps they were shivering in some cold, dark place, calling out for the parents who could not reach them. As the police scrambled to bury the case in oblivion, the fire of suspicion burned ever hotter in the hearts of George and Jenny Sodder. The absence of bones in the ash was absolute proof that the children were not in that room when the fire consumed it. Someone had taken them during the chaos, or perhaps just before the match was struck, and vanished into the night. Desperate at the silence of the authorities, the parents decided to use their own life savings to find their children. They placed ads in newspapers and pleaded on the radio, their voices raw with grief. Then, breaking the silence, eyewitness accounts began to pour in from across the country. One account was impossible to ignore. A waitress working at a roadside diner 50 miles from the Sodder home recalled a scene from the morning after the fire. In the early hours, strange men with Italian accents had walked in for breakfast with 5 children. Her testimony was bone-chilling in its detail. The children looked exhausted and terrified. "When I tried to approach them to speak," she said, "the men blocked me with a murderous glare and spoke something harsh in Italian. They hurriedly left with the children." The children's descriptions matched the missing Sodder siblings perfectly. They were being led away by strange adults to an unknown destination. A second sighting came from a hotel in South Carolina. A hotel employee testified that 4 sturdy men and 2 women checked in with 5 children. They did not allow the children to step a single foot out of the room. The children were seen weeping while staring out the window, but the adults kept the curtains tightly drawn and blocked all contact with the outside world. The terror in the children's eyes was undeniable. All these sightings pointed in one direction. The kidnappers were moving with the precision of an organized syndicate, and their destination was likely an area with a high Italian immigrant population or perhaps across the border. George took this critical evidence to the FBI. He even wrote a personal letter to the director at the time, J. Edgar Hoover. Surprisingly, a reply came from Hoover stating they were ready to assist if the local police requested cooperation. But the local police and the fire department flatly refused the FBI's help. "There is no reason for federal intervention in a simple house fire," was their logic. The local authorities acted as if they were taking orders from someone, perfectly blocking any outside interference to bury the case as a mere accident. Behind this bizarre obstruction lay an even darker truth. The Sodders hired a private investigator to re-examine the case from the ground up. A few days later, the investigator found something buried in the ruins of the house. A small metal box covered in charcoal and dust. When they carefully opened it, they found pieces of raw, unburned flesh inside. They looked like human organs. Someone had buried them there to make it appear they were the remains of the children. But after a precise analysis at the hospital, the truth emerged. They were not human. It was fresh, butchered beef liver. What was even more startling was that the meat had not been touched by the heat of the fire. Someone, after the fire was extinguished, had deliberately buried beef liver to stage a death or to inflict a devastating psychological blow on the parents. It was a sick and cruel theater. Who was behind this demonic act? The investigation revealed that one of the fire department officials cleaning the site after the fire had found this liver and lied to George, telling him it was his child's heart. He had gone to the extent of such a macabre fraud just to finalize the children's deaths as official. The conspiracy did not end there. The investigator unearthed another heart-stopping truth. That insurance agent who had cursed George, saying his house would turn to smoke and his children would be destroyed. That very man was now sitting as a member of the coroner's jury investigating the case. The man suspected of threatening the Sodder family was now in the seat of judgment over the case. He used his influence to lead others to believe it was a simple accident and ignored the testimonies of witnesses who had seen the children alive. It was a situation where the criminal himself held the scales of justice. The Sodders were hitting a massive wall. The entire town, the entire administration, seemed to be in league to erase the very existence of the children. In the depths of despair, George Sodder played his final hand. He erected a massive billboard on the side of the highway right in front of their former home. On it were large black and white photographs of the 5 missing children, and beneath them in blood-red letters, it read, "Seeking witnesses." He also promised a massive reward for anyone who could find the children. That billboard stood there for years through rain and snow, reminding every passerby of this horrific tragedy. At night, when the lights hit the billboard, the children's eyes glowed like ghosts in the dark. George and Jenny stood under that board every day, staring at the road. They hoped that perhaps their children, now grown, might drive by and stop after seeing their own childhood photos. But the road remained silent, and that mysterious car the children had taken never appeared again. Time passed with a cold cruelty. When the parents' hair had turned as white as snow, a nun in the town approached Jenny and whispered a secret. "When I was working in the hospital, a dying patient made a confession to me," she said. "He said that on that night, he was the one who set fire to the Sodder home and took the children away in a truck. But the nun said she could not reveal the man's name due to her vow of confidentiality and vanished into thin air. The truth was always within reach, but it would disappear like smoke the moment they tried to grasp it. It was as if someone were laughing in the dark." Time marched on with a heartless rhythm until the year 1967 arrived. 22 years had passed since the fire consumed the Sodder home and the children vanished like smoke into the night. One day, a letter arrived for the aged and ailing mother, Jenny Sodder. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, but there was no return address to be found. Jenny felt her heart drop into her stomach. With hands trembling like dry leaves, she carefully opened the envelope. What slid out was not a letter, but a faded black and white photograph. In the picture, a young man in his mid-20s stared directly into the camera. He had thick eyebrows, a prominent nose, and a peculiar smile where one corner of his lip curled upward. The moment Jenny saw that face, her heart nearly stopped, and she collapsed to the floor in a piercing scream. That young man bore a soul-chilling resemblance to her missing second son, Louis Sodder. It wasn't just a similarity. It was the exact face Louis would have possessed had he survived that hellish fire and grown into a man. When she flipped the photograph over, she found cryptic codes scribbled in a jagged, uneven hand. Louis Sodder. "I love my brothers, the Frankie brothers. Little boys. A90132. Sentences that were impossible to decipher. Who the Franke brothers were or what those numbers meant remained a mystery, but the name at the top, Louis Sauter, was crystal clear. It was a sign of life sent 20 years later, a desperate cry for help from the shadows. The parents clung to that photograph and wept. Their children were alive somewhere, and now that they were grown, they were trying to find their way back home. But the young man's eyes in the photo looked profoundly sad and strangely guarded. It appeared as though he had sent that picture at the risk of his life, hiding from those who watched his every move. His message seemed to say, "I am alive, but I cannot return of my own will." Were the Franke brothers the ones who had taken him, or was it the name of the organization that kept him captive? Was the number A90132 the zip code of the place where he was being held? George Sauter wanted to drive to Kentucky that very instant, but his body was now too frail to even stand. Here is where the second terrifying turn of the story occurs. George hired a famous and skilled private investigator named Tinsley as a final hope. George gave him a massive sum of money and pleaded with him to find the young man in the photograph and bring him back. Investigator Tinsley set off for Central City, Kentucky. A few days later, a phone call came for George. Tinsley's voice on the line was electric with excitement. "George, I've found him," he said. "I've heard reports of a man who looks exactly like the one in the photo. They seem to be living on a farm on the outskirts of town. I'm heading there right now." Those were his final words. After hanging up that phone, Investigator Tinsley vanished like a ghost. He did not return on the agreed-upon date, and he never called again. George tried everything to find him, but not a single trace of Tinsley could be found in all of Kentucky. His motel room was left clean, and his car had disappeared. The man who went to find Louis had vanished into smoke just like the children had decades before. What did this mean? It meant that even after 20 years, that dark force was still keeping a suffocating watch over the children, and it was a terrifying warning that anyone who dared to touch the truth would be erased. In the face of that massive darkness that had swallowed even their investigator, the Sauters finally broke. The photograph their son had sent was no longer a symbol of hope, but a jagged blade of despair that pushed them deeper into a well of agony. The Louis in the photo remained silent, staring at his aging parents with those mournful eyes. Why hadn't he written an address? Why hadn't he come in person? Perhaps he realized on the day the investigator disappeared that lives were being lost because of the letter he sent, and he surrendered to a life of silence. A year later, in 1968, George Sauter, who had spent his entire life searching for his children, finally passed away. Even at the moment of death, in his blurred consciousness, he reached out into the empty air, calling the names of his children one by one. Martha. Louis. Maurice. "We have to put out the fire, the ladder is gone." His voice echoed in the vacant room, and his life ended without ever knowing if his children were truly alive. The brave father who had fought against fascists and the mafia died a broken, frail old man at the hands of a grief that never healed. The mother, Jenny Sauter, was left alone, dressed in black, standing before the massive billboard her husband had built. She began to plant beautiful flowers around the house. She wanted to ensure that if the children ever returned, they would know this was not a ruin, but still a warm home where their mother waited. Every day, she sat at the door and watched the passing cars. Every time the mailman arrived, she ran out barefoot to check the letters, but a second photograph never came. Jenny never changed the house's telephone number until the day she died. Terrified that the children might call even in the middle of the night, she never left the side of that phone. The seasons changed, and her hair turned as white as the winter snow, but her vigil never ended. Though the flowers bloomed and withered dozens of times, that mysterious car the children had taken never appeared on that road again. In 1989, Jenny also closed her eyes for the last time. After her death, the old billboard that had stood as a symbol of the town for over 40 years was finally taken down. The black and white photos of the children, faded by the wind and rain, were loaded onto a truck and taken to the landfill. The townspeople whispered. It would have been better if the children had truly died in the fire that night. If bones had been found, the parents would not have lived in a double hell of hope and grief for their entire lives. But that fire site, without a single bone, had handed them a sentence more cruel than death, a silent, eternal separation. The old land where the house once stood was left vacant after the parents were gone. But the townspeople say that on stormy nights, a shadow can still be seen wandering there. Was it Louis, returning to find his parents, or was it a spirit coming to take the souls of the parents to the other side? The code the young man left on the photo, A90132, was perhaps the address of the hell where they were imprisoned. The truth remained locked inside that envelope, buried forever. The case of the missing Sodder children has been etched into American history as one of the most bizarre and heartbreaking cold cases ever recorded. Over 80 years have passed since the fire devoured the Sodder home, yet the fate of those 5 children remains shrouded in a thick, impenetrable fog. The fragments of a military-grade napalm bomb found in the ruins, the phone line professionally severed by an expert, the ladder hidden deep in the dark forest, and that haunting photograph of a son that arrived 20 years later like a ghost. All this evidence screams a single, terrifying truth. Those children did not burn to ash that night. They were forcibly abducted by someone in the darkness, under the cover of the chaotic fire. Criminologists and thousands across the internet believe this was more than a simple kidnapping. It was a calculated act of vengeance by a powerful organization. George Sodder had openly criticized the Italian dictator Mussolini, and the mafia henchmen in his own backyard worshipped him. Perhaps they decided that instead of killing George, they would hand him the most cruel sentence a human can endure. To steal his 5 children, who were more precious to him than his own life. To leave those parents to wither away for the rest of their lives in a double hell of memory and longing. That was the true revenge, the ultimate murder of the soul. So, what became of the missing children? Those children led away by men with Italian accents may have been forced onto a ship, crossing the Atlantic to some remote village in Italy. There, they may have been forced to forget their roots and their true names, living as nothing more than slaves to a lie. Or perhaps they were taken to another state within America and handed over to another family, where their Sodder surname was stripped away and they were given a new identity to grow up without a past. This explains why Louis Sodder's eyes in that photograph looked so mournful and guarded. By the time he became a man, he had learned the truth of his real family, but the fear of the shadows watching him kept him from ever coming home. That cryptic message on the back of the photo was the only expression of love he could send to his parents, a final goodbye that could never truly reach them. Perhaps he realized on the day the investigator vanished that lives were being lost because of the letter he sent, so he chose a lifetime of silence to protect what was left of his family. Today, only a small marker remains on that land in Fayetteville. But when Christmas Eve arrives and the white snow falls, the townspeople still speak of the Sodder children. Some say they have heard the laughter of children on the wind coming from the forest, or that charred fragments of toys are still found at the site. Perhaps it is a mournful proof that those souls, so unjustly taken, have still not found their way home and are wandering the place where their parents waited for them. Did the Sodders and their children finally meet in the next life? Or are they still wandering, searching for one another even there? This tragedy leaves us with a cold question. Is your home safe? Tonight, is the door to the room where your family sleeps soundly truly locked? For the Sodders, that night was a happy and peaceful Christmas too. Calamity arrives without warning, wearing a kind mask in the moment you are most joyful. The phone ring heard days before the fire, the footsteps on the roof, the stranger staring at the fuse box, and the mysterious eyes watching the window from the darkness. Those seemingly small signs may be the signal that your peace is about to vanish forever. While we sleep, the darkness is awake. Behind the fence of your house, in the back seat of your car, or perhaps behind the very screen of the smartphone you are holding now, someone is watching you with envy for your happiness. Evil needs no reason. It simply exists, and the moment you show weakness, it will snatch away the most precious thing you own, just as they did to the Sodder children. In this world, there are thousands of files buried in the shadows where the light does not reach. The shadow files will continue to dig and record the truths buried by power and time. We will call the names of those being forgotten once more, and we will unmask the true faces of the predators hiding in the dark. Alone, you will be afraid to face this massive darkness. But if we are together, we can become the torch that illuminates the truth. If you want to join this dangerous yet alluring journey and become a witness to the memory of the missing children, please press that red subscribe button you see now. It is not a simple click. It is a promise that we will protect one another, and the only lifeline to keep us from losing our way in the dark. Your likes and comments are the small candles that light the way for lost souls to find their way home. Your interest is what will call the Shadow Files back to this place. The next record contains an even more shocking and unbelievable truth. Until then, check your window one last time before you sleep. And whatever you do, never look back. Because someone may be calling you from the darkness.